Hi, welcome to Hegel on the Beach. Force and Understanding, it's number 8. Appearance in the supersensible world. Okay, so force. Hegel's talking about Newtonian physics, and understanding that's the next step in the development of consciousness, and it's to do with the scientific way of looking at the world. So I think Hegel's using the word understanding because this type of consciousness is about explanations and reasons, scientific explanations and reasons. Why and because. What's the scientific reason behind why it rains? Not because of God, because of clouds and particles and water droplets and so on. 132. In the dialectic of sensuous certainty, hearing and seeing are bygones for consciousness, and as perceiving, consciousness has arrived at thoughts which it brings together only in the unconditioned universal. So what's an unconditioned universal? That's something, a phrase that you'll hear a lot of in Hegel in this particular section. So paragraph 129 says, from out of sensuous being, it becomes a universal, but since it emerged from out of the sensuous, this universal is essentially conditioned by the sensuous and is thus not truly self-equal. Okay, so a conditioned universal has something to do with the object, which hasn't been sublated or changed through theoretical reflection. Okay, the object needs to be changed to an unconditioned universal, a fully transformed and self-subsistent concept. So if conditioned universals have to do with the senses, then unconditional universals would seem to be the opposite, maybe universals that don't rely on the senses. Okay, so our senses give us information, which in order to make any kind of comprehension of it, we need to be classified under through a scientific method. So it doesn't have to be, not all occasions, but this is what this type of consciousness is about. So unconditioned universality is a type of theoretical folder that we've got. Theoretical, I'm going to put it, theoretical, you just adjust this, a theoretical approach to consciousness. So the unity of the object doesn't come from the senses, it's the result somehow of the non-sensible, the theoretical. The non-sensible, unconditioned universal appears to be the same thing as Kant's thing in itself. Now, we're not going to go down the road of Kant, but we do need to know a little bit about him. You probably need to know a lot about him really to understand this passage. But Kant's thing in itself is what Kant said was, you can only know appearances. You can't really know the things in themselves. And he posited this thing called the thing in itself. And Locke had the substance, I know not what. And this is called by Hegel the supersensible. And that's almost made the limit of my understanding of this section. It's about 20 or 30 pages, and it's like, it's so difficult to go through. But anyway, moving on. Harris puts it like this: the consciousness we are observing has to become scientific. It's aware that it's operating in a world of pure theory, but it takes the theoretical realm to be a supersensible world. Consciousness takes the supersensible world to be the beyond of our perception, the absolute thing within all perceived things, which all perceived things move. Harris goes on, we know this to be a mistake because we've seen how the dialectic of thing consciousness, which are previous modes of consciousness, give birth to the self-concept, which is not and cannot be a thing in the simple perceptual sense. Paragraph 1 through, on this paragraph 134. The result was that the unconditioned universal, at first in the negative and abstract sense, that consciousness negated its one-sided concepts and abstracted them. That is to say, it gave them up. However, the result has in itself the positive meaning that therein the unity of being for itself and being for another, or the absolute opposition, is immediately posited as the same essence. So being for itself and being for another. So being for itself is the object outside our consciousness, and the being for another is how we perceive the object. So Harris says, consciousness is essentially thing consciousness. That is to say, it's an object that is categorically assumed to be what it is independently of whether we are conscious of it or not. So as I said then, it's whether the thing exists in itself, whether we're seeing it or not. When we turn our back, like I mentioned in that film, what's it called, The Perfect Getaway, there's stuff still there, isn't it? We know. But the consciousness that we're observing has been driven by the dialectic thinkhood to abandon the view that any finite thing can be simply what it is for itself. So we can't, so these things exist, but we can't, how do we get them in our heads? So it's no good just saying they're there. We've got to do something with this theoretical form of consciousness. The simple concept of the directly perceived thing has, bear with me, has evolved into an unconditioned community of all things, but as perceivers, we still naively assume that the reflection which brought about this transformation in our minds is external. The unconditioned community of things, which every single member is for itself, the totality of what it is for all the other things, this community is just like an unperceived thing, i.e. it really is what it is, whether or not we are conscious of it or not. The unconditioned universal is the thing in itself. We have finally freed it from its dependence upon our sense awareness. That's an extremely difficult passage that Harris has written. So whoever you pick, you pay your money, you take your choice. You can read the Hegel and then read the next sentence, and sometimes it just sounds the same, or it sounds, as difficult as each other. But we have already seen that the concept of thing logically involves our awareness of it. Being and being known are the moments of thinghood. So the resting essence of the unconditioned universal cannot be taken simply, for then it would become the extreme of being for self. And we find ourselves back again in this very dialectic of thing consciousness that produced it. If we allow that, we shall be thrown back into the contradictory pretenses of perceptual consciousness. This back-turning circle is, of course, the normal condition of the perceptual understanding of the common sense. Okay, so 5. So we ought not to call the unconditioned universal the thing in itself, as Kant does, for as we've seen, that it's the resolution of those pretenses. When it returned to itself, it did so because we recognized that our reflection upon it was its own self-reflection. Thus, we've already moved from the concept of the thing, the object of experience, to the self-concept prior to experience. So that is supposedly how Hegel solves the Kant riddle of the thing in itself. The consciousness that we are observing has become scientific. Hegel's phenomenological method, so it's how we experience the world. That's what the phenomenological method is. Works precisely because we actually observe in the logical process and result of each stage just what the observed consciousness must discover in its experience at the next stage. So what Hegel's saying is that's how we manage. That's why he overcomes Kant's dilemma, because we're able to see it as a stage on the road of developing consciousness, not as something that's out there that we have to discover. It's kind of like how our mind works. The adequate concept of sense certainty is not the identifiable thing, and the adequate concept of perception is the intelligible community of things. But this means that the experiencing consciousness conceptualizes each new stage in terms of the previous stage. So that's the secret. That's how he gets over it. He's looking back at previous stages of consciousness. Our object is precisely the understanding as the still unself-conscious concept that has the thing in itself as its object. Okay, so 134. The truth of all perceiving and its relationships. Oh no, I'll skip 134. I'll just do the Harris bit. All perceiving is just our subjective consciousness, because 134 is a big long thing. Okay, we've reached the unconditioned universal negatively by okay. That's so. All perceiving is just our subjective consciousness of this intelligible world. But we know that the system of perceived and perceivable relations is the intelligible world, for otherwise we could not have come to know that this intelligible reality is what it truly is. The identity of the conceived reality with the perceivable is the positing of the absolute Gegensatz as that same essence, the one that does not need awareness of it. So, moving on, let's try to explain that. That's Harris. That's not even Hegel. That's Harris. That's what he's coming up with, and that's, you know, What's that? That's like these clouds. It's so difficult to penetrate this. So it's important to realize that it's the scientific understanding that we're concerned with here. That of the scientist who does a certain type of natural science. We must distinguish the empirically scientific understanding from the philosophical understanding. The philosophical understanding produces the common sense theory of perception, which Hegel attacks in paragraph 131. The scientific understanding misunderstands itself, but not the world. So science gets the world, but not itself. Doesn't get itself. For Hegel, the worldview developed by science, the concept that it offers of the whole within which we live and die, is one form of the necessary knowledge of the absolute that we have to have from the start. The scientists who develop that view may or may not understand the transition between perception and understanding, but even a scientist who has no conception of what Hegel means by saying that in the understanding of perception, we have a result in which the unity of being for self and being for another is posited, may be wiser than the sages who despise his understanding. So the scientist is more real than the philosopher, in a sense. Paragraph 135. As an object for consciousness, the antithesis presents itself as that of many matters and one form. The passive multiplicity that appears for another on one side, and the invisibly active unity that is in itself on the other. The unconditioned universal is the transition of these moments back and forth. The unconditioned universal is the transition from passivity to actively trying to recreate the world in consciousness. So we can see now that Hegel's analysis of the lump of salt perception was conducted with one eye on the worldview of understanding. There are many kinds of matter, and there is nevertheless a balance of forces. Okay, so here's the punchline. So everything's stable so far as it's stable is stable because it's in the state that the total balance of nature requires. And the example of salt was chosen because it exemplifies the state of neutrality. Okay, so sorry, coming now. So the neutral matters, which were of the objective side of perception, turned into the phenomenal side of understanding. Things are not independent; they are simply stable appearances for us. So that's the punchline for me. Our senses perceive it as salt at any moment in that 1,000 years. We just perceive it in an instant, don't we? We just perceive the salt of the trees in one instant, and that is what that's the difficulty, isn't it? We don't see, this night turning into day. We don't see that. We just see it for one instant, and that is and that's what human understanding is. We're human beings, and we're only here for a finite amount of time, and our attention can only be directed to one object for a short amount of time. So para 136, force is both the absolute source of the spreading out and the unity to which it returns. The moment of spreading out is utterance. Force proper is the exclusive unity, but the moments are identical. This is Hegel now, and this identity is the concept we hold together and speak for. We separate the moments, and we think the difference in the unity, but the understanding is conscious of force as real. The object is for itself the self-uttering force that appears to consciousness as other. To be real is to be released from thought. The force proper is also the comprehended whole. So it's one concept of force that exists in these opposite ways. So we've got to see force. We've got to have the concept of force to comprehend the whole. The concept of force is, this is Harris now, is the concept of a center and the concept of a field. Both moments are equally necessary. Hegel's concept of force is the identity of the physical source of this variety of appearance with its concept in the intellect. The physical source cannot be located on one side or the other of the divided structure of perceptual consciousness. It is not in the perceiving body or in the perceived body or in both together or in their coming together. On the contrary, they, being all of them phenomena, are equally manifestations of it. Again, it's a really tough read that. You might have to go read it, then listen to my voice as you're reading it and see if you can make sense of it. And that's in the Harris bit. Okay. Force, therefore, is what logically must manifest itself. There has to be a world of being and a world of thought that are independent of each other. The interaction of these two and their eventual coincidence is the topic of this chapter. Yeah, it's straightforward. The movement of the understanding is the same as that of perception, where the truth taker and what is truly taken coincide at one moment. Yet each side is also reflected into itself and subsists separately. Knower and known are similarly moments of force. Causal laws are really about, and I think it starts to be a bit clearer here, and then it'll be difficult again. Causal laws are really about uniformities in appearance. These laws exist because we're able to make predictions. We know that when I drop an apple, it'll fall to the ground. That law describes what's happening, but it doesn't explain why. Hegel, however, is saying that this is how we modern, science-savvy inhabitants of the modern era understand the world. This form of consciousness is how a scientific view of the world sees itself, how it sees regularities and sees how we unify appearances with the things underlying the appearance. Okay, so Isaac Newton believed that the world was written in the language of mathematics. I don't know whether he actually believed this, but I think that's in his poetical sense. He meant that, God had written these equations and it was up to us just to discover what they were. And if we understood the equations, bingo, we understood reality. Scientific thinking assumes that scientific laws describe the underlying reality of the universe. So this is the supersensible, non-sensible interpretation of the world. So this is the supersensible realm, okay? Paragraph 146, okay? The Ding in sich, which is thing in itself, is what does not appear. Ding in sich is the German, my bad German. This is logically determined truth, not an empirical limit. The beyond may be pure light or blank darkness. So what he means by that is this thing in itself, it could be a dark thing. Schiller said, well, it could be like blind, beautiful light, but light, just light on its own, you can't see anything in just light. If you've got like someone shining like a 200-watt bulb in your face, it doesn't make things any better. So there's got to be something in between. There's got to be something tangible there, not just uniform nothingness, light or dark. So there's no mediating link. Back to paragraph 146. It's either light or dark. There's nothing in between. And mediation is very important for Hegel. We must either call it Erscheinung, truth, or fill the void with subjective imaginings. Okay, so paragraph 147. However, the inner or the supersensible otherworldly beyond has developed. It comes forth out of appearance, and appearance is its mediation. That is, appearance is its essence and, in fact, its fulfillment. The supersensible is the sensuous, and the perceived posited as they are in truth. However, the truth of the sensuous and the perceived is to be appearance. The supersensible is therefore appearance as appearance. However much it is thought that the supersensible is therefore the sensuous world, or the world as it is for immediate sensuous certainty and perception, still, this is an inverted understanding of the supersensible. For appearance is instead not the world of sensuous knowing and perceiving as an existing world. It's rather the world posited or sublated or posited in truth as the inner. It is commonly said that the supersensible is not appearance, but appearance. I mean, come on. Appearance in quotation marks. What's that about? There is no, but appearance there is not understood to be appearance, but rather to be the sensuous world being being itself real actuality. So I mean, come on, what the hell's he getting at there? Okay, so I wrote this because it was just didn't make any sense at all. I wrote these. So these are how I tried to summarize it. So Newton takes force as the ultimate, as I said before, explanatory principle of the world, mathematics, force, I should say. So Kant prefers causality. So this idea of force, it comes from Newton. And this section's about Newton and Kant. So Kant wanted to ground the world of appearances in the mind. We know that, don't we? That was what the Copernican revolution was about. It was about putting the mind, trying to get the human understanding at the center of of I want to say comprehension. It is comprehension, isn't it? So we're trying to shift the balance from God creating the world to us making sense of the world. Hegel inverts Plato. The supersensible world comes from the worlds of appearances, the senses. So the world, the supersensible world, comes from appearances. They don't come from down on high. They come from the real world, for want of a better word. Paragraph 149. Law is the stable picture of unstable appearances. The supersensible world is thus a motionless realm of laws, which I think that's something else that I was writing last night, and that just popped out at me. So appearance can't be the embodiment of theory till we have a theory. Even controlled experiments need to be repeated over and over again. Well, not all the time, but they do need to be repeated to prove certain stuff. Real experiments involve self-conscious activity. Humans designing the experiments. The laws don't design themselves. We've got to prove the laws. And that involves rational planning. It involves choice. It involves what to look at. You know, if I'm a biologist, I'm choosing to look at this particular plant, or I'm choosing to look at that particular cloud. It's not just imposing itself on me. So Hegel is critical of law within natural science. Law enables us to describe, but it doesn't account for the reasons. That sounds like a tautology, but I want to read, there's a passage I would like to read from about, let me read this. It's from John Dupre, Human Nature and the Limits of Science. And this is about scientific understanding. I happened to turn on the third install. This is great reading, so relax now. You don't have to put your thinking caps on, just listen. I happened to turn on the third installment of a television series on human hormones. The official topic of this episode was love. In between images of chemical clouds bubbling out of glands and diffusing through the body, the program traced the effects of hormones on sexual differentiation in utero and in puberty. Distinguished scientists reported the exciting and sometimes surprising results of our recent ability to measure the levels of hormones in bodies, and correlations between these levels and the emotional states of the subjects were noted. Although much of the work was admitted to be at a somewhat speculative stage, the scientists involved expressed no reservations about the possibility that love might turn out to be caused by, or just be, such ontological subtleties as were not addressed, a sequence of hormonal surges. Nor did members of the public ask to comment on some of these scientific claims, though some expressed the view that the topic of love should be left to the poets and that these scientific facts were better left unknown. The program illustrates the hold of our culture, of what I call scientism, an exaggerated and often distorted conception of what science can be expected to do or explain for us. And Dupre continues, John Dupre. Supposedly, science must work by disclosing the mechanisms that generate phenomena. Together, these ideas imply a narrow and homogeneous set of answers to the most diverse imaginable set of questions. Everywhere this implies a restriction of the powers of the human mind. But nowhere is this restriction more disastrous than the mind's attempt to answer questions about itself. So there you go. We need science, but it's not everything. John Dupre said it without disappearing up his own selfhood. Bad science, when directed at human nature or society, is always liable to lead to bad practice. And if there's one overriding reason for people to care about dubious science, it's because it lends support to pernicious social policy. So is that a bit more? Yeah. Science, it's often said, is the religion of our era. I like this part. Where once we expected priests to give us insight into the nature of the cosmos and of human existence, now we rather look to men and sometimes women in white coats. White lab coats, where once public expenditure is in the service of deeper truths might have taken the forms of mighty cathedrals, today it's found in cyclotrons and gene sequences. No one now thinks the world as early modern philosophers tended to as composed of tiny billiard balls. The idea, rather, has been to tie the materialist doctrine to whatever account of the physical world physicists finally agree upon. Physicalists, like modern materialists, then hold that this final physical story about the world's ultimate constituents is, in some sense, the whole truth about the world. This idea is sometimes referred to as the thesis of the completeness of physics. So the truth about physical stuff, therefore, in my view, is very far from being the truth about everything. And next week we're going to have to do, unfortunately, more of this force and understanding. But then it's done. Then it's out the way. I think it's just a lot of stuff about Newtonian physics and science and force, and I don't think that. Yeah, you need to know about the scientific understanding, but you don't need to go into this much detail. It's I won't say skip it, but there's much more there are many more interesting passages and many more clear ones. So this is just a bit of a nightmare. So on that sad note, miserable note, see you later.